In this tutorial, we learn how to use the Spring MVC framework to replace our existing Java Enterprise Edition 8 command pattern and servlet logic of our charity registration web application. We are going to learn how to use the Spring MVC framework by first replacing our JEE8 servlets with Spring controllers. Then we'll use the request mapping restrictions in our controllers, and we will use Spring controller method parameters. These are the steps we will take to migrate our servlet command application to the Spring MVC pattern. First, we'll set up the Spring framework. We'll convert our existing servlets to Spring controllers. We will replace the command pattern with the request mapping in the Spring controllers. We will handle the request parameters, and we will refactor our switch statements. Part of that is also the handle request and response objects. We will bring in the Spring dependency injection paradigm. We'll update our view resolution, and then we'll test and debug that everything still works as it did in our old command pattern application. We will update all of our configurations using the inherent Spring configurations, and we'll focus on a gradual migration and on documenting everything. This is how we'll use the request mapping attributes to narrow request mapping. First, we will use URL restrictions. Then we'll use HTTP request method restrictions. We will use request parameter restrictions, request header restrictions, and content type restrictions. Then finally, we'll specify our controller method parameters. We can use standard servlet types. We can use annotated request properties, input bound form objects, and request body conversions and entities, and finally multi-part request data. We will select valid return types for our controller methods using model types, view types, response body entities, any return type, and asynchronous return types. Now we are going over to our GitHub Pages course documentation. We'll go down to the Spring Framework Enterprise Development, and here we see our overview. So we'll start with replacing our servlets with Spring controllers, and we'll see these are the steps to migrate from our command pattern servlets to the Spring framework. First, we integrate the Spring framework into our project by adding Spring dependencies and configuring our Spring context. Then we convert our servlets to Spring controller by identifying the existing servlets that we want to migrate, and then we'll create corresponding Spring controller classes. We use the controller annotation. Then we replace the command pattern with request mapping in the existing servlets. If we are using the command pattern with switch statements, we identify commands or actions that are handled in each case. We create methods in our Spring controller for each command or action. We use the request mapping annotation on these methods to map them to specific URLs or request patterns. We handle our request patterns by modifying our methods in the Spring controller to accept parameters using annotations like request parameter, path variable, etc. And we base that on the parameters passed to the servlet. Then we refactor our switch statement. Instead of using switch statements for flow control, we leverage Spring's declarative approach. Each method in our Spring controller should focus on handling a specific request or action. Then we handle request and response objects. We modify the code to utilize the HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response objects appropriately. In Spring, we can use method parameters or inject these objects directly. We utilize Spring's dependency injection to inject services or other components needed by our controllers. Here we can use annotations like auto-wire. We update our view resolutions. If our servlets were responsible for rendering views, we update the logic to use Spring's view resolution mechanism. Here we use annotations like response body or model and view to view responses. Then we thoroughly test the migrated controllers to ensure they handle all our requests correctly. We debug and resolve any issues that arise during the migration process. Where we previously used configurations files specific to Jakarta Enterprise Edition, we update or replace them Spring configuration files like the application context XML or Java-based configuration. Now, in general, we should always consider using a gradual migration approach for large applications. We generally start by migrating one servlet at a time, ensuring that each one works as expected. And finally, we'll update our documentation to reflect the changes. By following these steps, we can migrate Jakarta Enterprise Edition 8 servlets using the command pattern to Spring controllers with request mapping in a systematic and organized manner. This process allows you to leverage Spring's features and benefits while maintaining and improving the functionality of your web application. Now back to Spring Framework Enterprise Development. And we've just completed the replacement overview. Now we'll look at the request mapping restrictions. At request mapping is an annotation in Spring used to map web requests to specific handler methods in a controller. It can be applied at the class level to indicate the base URI for all methods in the controller and or at the method level to narrow down the mapping. We look at using request mapping attributes to narrow request mapping. Attributes like method, params, header, and consumes can be used with request mapping to further narrow down the mapping. For example, using method equals request method get ensures that the method only handles get request. And we look at URL restrictions. You can use value or path attributes in request mapping to specify the URL patterns that the methods should handle. For example, at request mapping /example will map to request with the URL pattern /example. And we look at request header restrictions. The headers attribute in request mapping can be used to specify the required request headers for the method to be invoked. Here is the example request mapping value /example headers e value. Then we also look at content type restriction. The consumes attribute in request mapping restricts the content types that the method can consume. For example, here on example path, we only consume application JSON files. In the contents of Jakarta Enterprise Edition 8, Spring can be integrated with Jakarta Enterprise technologies to leverage features like context and dependency injection and the Java Persistence API alongside Spring's functionality. Core concepts of request mapping and handling remain consistent, and the second part delves into the specifics of specifying controller method parameters for enhanced data extraction from the incoming requests. Now we go over to using Spring controller method parameters. When we specify controller method parameters, We can accept various parameters like request parameter and path variable, etc. Here is an example. Get mapping example /id with a public string handle request, path variable id defined as long id. Then with standard servlet types, Spring supports the use of standard servlet types as method parameters like HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. Here is the example, public string handle request with the HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. Then we look at annotated request properties. You can use annotations like request header, cookie value, etc. to inject specific parts of the request into method parameters. Here is the example. We specify the request header as user agent and we pass in the string value user agent. Finally, we look at the using Spring MVC overview. Here is more detailed examples. In Spring MVC, we can use explicit views by returning a view object from our controller method. So here we return the example view. The redirect view class allows you to redirect to another URL. So here we redirect to another URL. Configuring view resolutions by defining view resolver beans in our Spring configuration. Here is a view resolver and we can set the prefix and the suffix and return the resolver. We can use JSP views for rendering dynamic content. We set the model attribute message and we return the example JSP view. Spring allows you to return a logical view name and it will look for a matching view. We set a model attribute and we return the implicit example view. We can configure view name translation using the locale resolver for internationalization. So here we return a specific resolver. We can use model attributes to bind method parameters or method level attributes to the model. Here we bind a string that says this is a common attribute. We can return response entities to have full control over the HTTP response. Here we say response entity OK with the string value. We can configure message converters, convert between HTTP request and Java objects. We add a mapping Jackson to HTTP message converter. We can configure content negotiation, which allows the application to respond to different types of requests. Here we specify all the content negotiation with a JSON type, and we can use the response body to indicate that the return value of a method should be directly written to the response body. And here is an example. In the context of Jakarta Enterprise Edition 8, integrating these Spring MVC features allows us to manage views, handle responses, and configure various aspects of content negotiation within our web application. And now we finally go to Eclipse. And what we are doing is we migrating our Jakarta Enterprise Edition 8 servlets to Spring controllers with request mapping. So here is our command pattern project, and here is our new charity Spring MVC project. And we are looking at the README file here. Step 1 is we add the necessary dependencies to our POM file. And if we look at our POM file, here is our Spring dependencies and any extra dependencies that we need. And way up here in the properties section, we define the version of Spring and all the other versions that we require, such as Jackson. Now back to README, and step 2 is where we create the Spring MVC Java base configuration context. We create a config package folder, and inside the package folder, we create our root context configuration. We create a bootstrap web application initializer. We create a servlet context configuration that implements the web MVC configurer. So let's look at that package and classes. We'll start off with the root context configuration. Base packages use default filters and including the controllers. We include an object mapper for mapping dates, and we include a JAXP marshaller. Then we look at our bootstrap, which is our web application initializer. So here we add the resources mapping, we add the root context, we add a servlet context to include the Spring dispatcher, set load on startup. Then we add the root mapping. Then we add the logging filter and the authentication filter. And then we add all the mapping for our URL patterns for our application. Finally, let's look at our servlet context configuration. Once again, we scan the controller class. We inject our mapper, our marshaller and unmarshaller. We implement the configure message converters, so we can do XML conversion. We can also do JSON mapping or JSON. Then we have this deprecated method where we configure the content negotiation, and I'll leave it for self-study to see what we need to replace it for in the later versions of Spring. Then we have our view resolver that puts us in the web INF JSP view folder and JSP suffix. We have our default request to view name translator and our multi-part resolver. Now back to our README. So we covered all our Spring configuration contexts. Now we are going to convert our servlets to Spring controller. Then I replace the command pattern with request mapping. We'll handle request parameters. We'll refactor our switch statements. We'll handle our request and response objects. We'll use dependency injection where we need it. And we'll update our view resolution. So now we have a registration controller, an index controller, and a session list controller. So let's look at our session list controller. We specify the controller request mapping of session. We have the list with a request method of get. Then we add a map model, and in our map we add the system time, the number of sessions in our in-memory session registry, and all the current sessions, and we will return the mapping of session list. So if we go to our presentation layer, under deployed resources, web INF JSP view session, we have our session list template that shows the total number of sessions and a for each that goes through the session list, gets the username, and it uses the time interval to string logic. Now we see this is a warning here. That's because we don't include it here. We include it in our base ASP fragment file where all our template logic is in. So here, this is where our date attributes are, and this is where our time interval to string has been declared. We'll only cover that one. We'll leave the rest of the controllers for self-study. Now back to our README file, and we are finally ready to run the project. So we will run as run on server, select localhost A. We see Our Charity Spring MVC is configured. Finish. And we'll enter one of our in-memory database users. And we've looked at the session. So we'll list the session. And now let's try and open another session in another browser. List sessions. And now we see the 2 sessions. And if we go back to this browser, we see it's been updated here. As previously, leave the rest for self-study, and we are ready to log out. And that concludes this tutorial. I will see you in the next one.